Clara Moss became a widow on the same day she turned 19. Not because the universe had arranged things with that particular cruelty in mind, but because the timing of the telegram and the timing of her birthday happened to occupy the same Thursday morning in February, and once both things had arrived in the same hour, they became permanently braided in her memory in a way that meant neither could be thought about without the other. The telegram was from the War Department. It used the language that War Department telegrams used, formal and compressed, and designed to deliver the maximum amount of necessary information in the minimum amount of space, as though grief were a thing that could be managed through brevity. Her husband's name was Daniel. He had been 21 years old and had been gone for 7 months and had written her letters every week without missing one until the letters stopped, which had been 3 weeks before the telegram, and which she had known, in the specific way that people knew things they could not yet afford to know, meant something she was not ready for. She read the telegram at the kitchen table of the cabin they had been married in, the cabin Daniel had built with his father the summer before their wedding, on 4 acres of land that his family had owned for 2 generations, in the hills outside a small town called Heron Creek that had 300 people and 1 general store and a post office that doubled as the place where news of all kinds arrived and dispersed at the speed of a community that size, which was very fast. She put the telegram down on the table. She looked at the kitchen walls that Daniel had built. The window he had fitted himself, slightly uneven in its frame, in a way that let a thin line of air through on the north side that she had stuffed with cloth, and that she had not yet decided whether to fix properly because fixing it felt like a decision about something larger than a window. She was 19 years old, and widowed, and alone in a cabin in the hills in February, and the war was not over, and would not be over for another 8 months, and the world had the quality of a place that was continuing its business with complete indifference to the fact that her particular piece of it had just collapsed. She did not leave the cabin. This was the decision that people in Heron Creek discussed with the combination of concern and incomprehension that small communities directed at choices they could not fit into an existing category. She should go to her mother's. She should go to Daniel's parents. She should come into town where people could see her, and she could be seen, and the communal management of grief could proceed in the organized fashion that communities had developed for that purpose over generations. Clara stayed in the cabin. She stayed because the cabin was what she had, not in the material sense only, though that was true too, in the sense that the cabin was Daniel's work, his hands in the walls and the floors and the fitted shelves, and the window that let cold air through on the north side. She was not ready to leave that. She was not ready to be anywhere that his hands had not been. She stayed, and she tried to manage the winter, and the winter was not interested in being managed. The cabin was cold, not uncomfortable cold, not the cold of a house that needed better curtains or another blanket on the bed, the cold of a structure built by a young man who had known how to build walls and a roof, but had not fully solved the problem of heat, which was a problem that revealed itself completely only in the sustained cold of a hill winter, when the fire in the range was the only heat source, and the fire required wood, and wood required going out to split it, and the cold required not going out. And the 2 requirements existed in a tension that could only be resolved by the one who had always been the one to resolve it, who was not there. She managed the wood. She was not a woman who had been raised without physical capability. She had grown up on a farm before Daniel, before the cabin, and she knew how to work and how to make things work, and how to keep going when keeping going was the only option. She split wood in the mornings when the temperature was at its least brutal, and she stacked it on the porch, and she kept the range going, and she was warm enough in the daytime when the fire was high, and cold in the mornings before it was built back up, and cold at night in the specific way of a space that held heat poorly. The range heated the cabin while it was burning, and lost the heat within 2 hours of the fire going down. She lay awake on the 2nd week of this, and thought about the heat, not as a grief or a comfort or a reminder of Daniel, but as a practical problem that required a practical solution, which was the mode of thinking she was finding most useful in those weeks, because practical problems had solutions, and solutions required action, and action was the only movement available to her that did not lead directly to the place she could not yet go. She thought about heat and how it moved, and how it was stored, and how the stone fireplace at Daniel's parents' house held warmth for hours after the fire was banked, because stone absorbed heat differently than air and released it slowly. She thought about stone. She thought about the river. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the 4 acres was not deep, but it was consistent, and it had, along its bed and banks, the rounded river stones that collected in running water over years of movement, smooth and dense, and in the particular size range that she was beginning to understand. Lying awake in the cold cabin, doing the mathematics of heat, might be exactly what she needed. She got up in the dark and went to the range and built the fire, and put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper. She drew the floor of the cabin. She thought about what she knew about stone and heat, and the way the fireplace at Daniel's parents' house worked. She thought about mass and surface area in terms she did not have the formal language for, but understood through the practical physics of having grown up around fire and stone and the management of both. She thought about what it would mean to fill the floor itself with the heat-holding material, to make the floor into the storage. She drew a cross-section. She sat with it until the light changed. Then she put on her coat and her boots and went to the creek. The work took the rest of February and most of March. She did not tell anyone in Heron Creek what she was doing because she did not want the conversation that would follow, which would be the conversation about whether she was all right, and whether she should really be living out there alone, and whether this particular project was the project of a person who was coping, or the project of a person who was not coping, and had converted the not coping into activity. She was aware that both of these things could be true simultaneously, and she did not want to navigate that conversation while she was in the middle of doing the thing. She carried stones from the creek. She carried them in a bucket, 2 buckets, one in each hand, which was the maximum she could manage on the ground that lay between the creek and the cabin, uneven hill ground that required attention to navigate without weight, and more attention with it. She made the walk from the creek to the cabin and back again until the light went each day, and she stacked the stones inside the cabin door in the growing pile that took up the corner and grew through the first week from modest to substantial, and through the second week from substantial to considerable. She had lifted the floorboards in the section of the cabin between the range and the center of the main room, which was the section that would receive the most direct heat from the range, and that would be the most effective location for a thermal mass layer. The boards came up with the specific resistance of boards that had been fitted well and had settled into their fitting over time, and she stacked them carefully because they would go back. The ground beneath the floorboards was compacted earth. She dug it down 4 inches across the entire section, which was harder work than the stone carrying, and took 3 days, and filled the corners of the cabin with the particular smell of turned earth in winter that was cold and clean and not unpleasant. She lined the excavated section with smaller flat stones first, fitting them together with the patience of someone who understood that a base done correctly was the only kind of base worth doing. Then she began filling in the layers. The river stones went in above the flat base layer, packed as tightly as the rounded shapes permitted, the largest ones in the bottom layer and the progressively smaller ones filling the gaps between, until the excavated section was filled to just below floor level with a dense packed mass of smooth river stone that she calculated, in the way she had been calculating since the kitchen table in the dark, would absorb the heat from the range above it and the floorboards through which the heat would move, and would hold that absorbed heat and release it slowly through the hours when the fire was low. She replaced the floorboards. She spent a day finding and filling the gaps between boards with a mixture of clay from the creek bank and dried grass that she had read about in one of the books on the cabin shelf as a traditional approach to floor sealing that predated the materials she did not have and could not afford. Then she built the fire. She built it in the evening, which was the right time for the test she had designed, because building it in the evening meant the fire could be allowed to burn high for 2 hours and then bank to coals, and the morning would tell her what the night had done. She sat by the range with the fire going and felt the warmth in the way she always felt it, the direct warmth of proximity to the heat source, and she waited. Around the 2nd hour, she became aware of something different. The warmth in the room was not located. It was not the warmth that came from one side because the fire was on one side. It was distributed in the way that warmth was distributed in a room that was releasing it from below rather than projecting it from a single point. The floor was warm under her feet in a way that the floor had never been warm. She banked the fire at the end of the 2nd hour and went to bed. She woke in the night and lay still and waited for the cold that came when the fire was down. The cold that had been waking her for weeks. The cold that arrived within 2 hours of the fire going low and settled into the room with the patient permanence of something that belonged there more than she did. The cold did not come. She lay in the dark and waited for it, and it did not come. The floor beneath the bed was warm, not hot, not the warmth of a fire, the warmth of stone that had stored something and was giving it back slowly, steadily, without drama, the way that stored things were given back when they had been held properly. She lay in the warmth in the dark at the hour when she had been lying awake cold for weeks, and felt something move in her that she could not have named precisely, but that had the quality of a door opening in a room that had been closed. She slept until morning. In the morning, the room was still warm. Not fully warm, not the warmth of a built fire, but warm in the residual way of a space that had been holding heat and had not finished releasing it. The floor was still above the ambient temperature she had been waking to for weeks. The air held the night's stored warmth in a way that it had never held it before. She built the fire again and sat by the range with her tea and thought about what she had done. She had not invented anything. She understood that. The use of thermal mass for heat retention was as old as human shelter, present in the thick walls of old houses, in the stone floors of farmhouses, in the earthen structures of people who had understood before formal understanding existed that mass and density absorbed and released heat differently than the air around them. She had not invented it. She had applied it, in the specific circumstances of a hill cabin in February, with the materials available within walking distance, to a problem that had been waking her up cold. But the specific application was hers. The knowledge that river stones, rounded and dense from years of water movement, fitted together with the efficiency of their shapes, packed below a timber floor in a layer of sufficient depth, would hold heat from a wood range for 11 hours in a hill winter. That was something she had worked out at a kitchen table in the dark, with a piece of paper and her own understanding of the materials she had. She wrote it down. Not that morning. That morning she was too close to it. But in the weeks following, as the winter continued and the stone floor performed what she had designed it to perform, and the cabin ceased to be a place she was surviving and became a place she was living, she began to write down what she had done and why, and what she had observed, and what she believed it meant for the problem of heat in structures of this type in this climate. She wrote in the evenings at the kitchen table, which was also Daniel's table, made by his hands, and she wrote with the precision of a person who had been educated adequately and read consistently, and whose mind worked in the organized, sequential way of someone who had been trusted from childhood to solve problems that needed solving. She sent the first letter to the County Agricultural Extension Office in April, not because she thought it was the right recipient for what she had written, but because it was the only institutional address she knew, and because she had decided that writing it down for herself was not sufficient. The extension officer, a man named Clement, who was in his 50s and had been dealing with rural practical problems his entire professional career, wrote back within 2 weeks with a response that surprised her. He said he had shown her description to 2 colleagues. He said they would like her to demonstrate what she had done. She wrote back and said she would. The demonstration happened in May, when the winter was over and the need for heat was theoretical rather than urgent, which she acknowledged in her correspondence with Clement as a limitation of the timing, but which could not be helped given how recently he had received her letter. 4 men came from the extension office, Clement and 3 others whose titles and institutional affiliations she noted in the letter she wrote that evening recording the visit. They were not condescending. She had prepared herself for condescension, and the preparation turned out not to be needed, which she noted without excessive surprise, because the preparation had also not cost her anything. They examined the floor. They asked questions with the specific quality of questions from people who were genuinely trying to understand something, rather than people who had already decided what they understood and were verifying it. She answered in the same way she had written, precisely and sequentially, beginning from the problem and moving through the reasoning to the solution and the observation. Clement asked her whether she had any background in construction or thermal engineering. She said she had a background in getting through winter. He wrote something in his notebook. He asked whether she would be willing to write a more formal account of her method, with the specific measurements and materials and the observed results over the winter period. She said she had already written it. She gave him the document she had prepared, 14 pages in her handwriting, covering the method from the initial reasoning through the material selection and preparation and installation, and the observed performance across the remaining weeks of winter, with the specific temperature differentials she had measured using the thermometer from the kitchen wall, and the time she had recorded when the warmth was present and when it had finally dissipated. Clement held the 14 pages and looked at them for a moment. He said he would like to have this reviewed by the engineers at the state office. She said he was welcome to take it. He said he would also like to know whether she had considered the possibility that this approach could be documented and shared more widely, because the problem of heat retention in rural structures of this type was not specific to her cabin, and the solution she had developed was, in his assessment, accessible to people without specialized knowledge or expensive materials. She looked at him. She said she had not thought about it as something for other people yet. He said that was understandable, given the circumstances under which she had developed it. She looked at the floor. The boards that she had lifted and replaced, the floor that had held heat for 11 hours on the first night she had tested it, the floor that had been warm under her feet in the dark when the cold she had been waiting for had not come. She said she would think about it. Clement and his colleagues left in the afternoon. She stood on the porch and watched the vehicle navigate the track back toward the road and disappear into the trees. The 4 acres were green in May, in the way that hill land was green in May. A green that had no equivalent in other seasons, specific to the particular light and the particular growth of that moment in a year that had started in the worst way a year could start, and had moved, through the specific mechanics of problem and solution, and the cold nights and the stones from the creek, into something that was not healed, and not whole, and not anything she had a word for yet, but that was different from February. Daniel had built the walls and the floor and the window that let in cold air on the north side. She had built the thing beneath the floor that made it possible to stay. She went back inside. She sat at the kitchen table and pulled the piece of paper toward her, the cross-section drawing she had made in the dark in February when the kettle was boiling and the telegram was still on the table, and the winter had not yet finished with her. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned it over and began to write the more formal account that Clement had asked for, beginning at the beginning the way she began everything, with the problem as it actually was, rather than the problem as it might have been, and working forward from there. Outside, the creek moved over the stones she had not taken, the ones that remained in the water doing the work that water did with stone, which was the work of a very long time, producing something very smooth, patient, and continuous, and entirely indifferent to the calendar. Clara wrote. The cabin was warm.